Hi there. Have you ever considered walking the Camino de Santiago in Spain? In 2015, at the age of 60, I did it, and I went alone. In this video, I'll share my story of my epic, terrifying journey, the struggles and highlights along the way, and what I learned about myself and humanity while walking. And I'll also like to tell you why I'm thinking of doing it again. I'm going to jump in for a minute here and say, before I get too far into this story, I've never told this story before. I have told pieces of it. I've written some parts of it, but I've never told the story. And I'd like to tell the story. Even if you bail on me, I still want to tell the story because I need to remember this. And I'm sure the day will come where it's already getting faded. It's 10 years ago. So anyways, just before I get into that, I just want to state that this was very out of character for me. I am a homebody. I am an indoor cat. When they arrested Martha Stewart and put a bracelet on her ankle and told her she couldn't leave the house, I thought, this is a punishment? Are you kidding me? I could do that all day long. Getting me out of the house is the challenge. So this was really out of character for me. And I want to talk to you, because if you're watching my video, then you're thinking about doing this. And if you're thinking about doing this, you're watching my video because you're trying to find either a way in or a way out. So I am excited for you. I think I understand how frightened you are and what a major decision. It's a major decision if you're a hiker. But wherever you are in the fitness scale, this is going to be really difficult physically, but it's not impossible at all. And there were people significantly older than me. I met a woman that was 80 years old that was walking the Camino. So if you're thinking about doing this, listen to my story. It's got some difficult stuff in it, but it was awesome. It was awesome. It was life-changing. I fell in love with humanity as a result of that trip, but I am getting ahead of myself. So let me get back to the slightly sequential story and then see how you feel at the end of the video about your trip to Spain on the Camino. Cool. So in 2010, I saw the movie called The Way, which starred Martin Sheen, and the premise of the story was his son went to Spain to walk the Camino and died crossing the Pyrenees on his first day out. So Martin's character flew to France to recover his son's remains and ended up choosing to make the trek in his honor. 2 years after seeing that movie, my 19-year-old son, Neil, crashed his motorcycle and was never seen again. And that changed my life. And I'll tell you, if you can survive losing a child, you can pretty much survive anything. So when the idea of the Camino turned up on my Pinterest feed in 2015, I think I was ripe for something to happen in my life to bring me back to life, to experience life after death, so to speak. Like I do, I became completely obsessed with the idea of going to Spain and talked about it incessantly, driving everyone in my life completely crazy. So for that matter, my boyfriend at the time asked me, are you going this year or next year? Meaning I cannot listen to you for an entire year talk about this. So after 6 weeks of almost no training, I packed up my bag and I jumped on a plane and flew to France. Everyone thought I was nuts. I thought I was nuts. I can't exaggerate, I cannot overstate how completely terrified I was. This was very out of character for me. No one could believe I was doing it. And you know, my mom's question was, can't you just walk in New Hampshire? And the answer is yes, you can walk in New Hampshire. But I needed to go to Spain for reasons that I couldn't explain to myself or to anyone else. I just knew that I was going, and I'm a little unstoppable once I get an idea into my head, and that was exactly the case with this trip. This is me on September 19th with my packed bag, standing on the front porch of my home. I look like I'm happy, but I'm terrified. I can't even exaggerate it. I'm completely terrified. For that matter, several pictures after this, I'm crying. So there's that. So the thing about the Camino is that you carry literally everything you own on your back. And that backpack might not have looked like much, but it was 17 pounds, which is more than they recommend you carry. They recommend 10% of your body weight. And even though 17 pounds may not sound like a lot, if you carry it for 500 miles, it's a lot. It's a huge lot. While preparing for the trip, I read something that said, you carry on the Camino the weight of your fears. And that's a true story, because along the way, along this 500-mile trek through the most stunning, beautiful, empty countryside that you could ever imagine seeing, the side of the road was littered with things that people thought they had to have on this journey and found out that they could not bear. They didn't need it. The weight was too much. It was, you know, they just dropped it along the way. I was one of those. The first thing that went was a book that I thought I had to have. A book. They weigh 1,000,000 pounds. The second was a selfie stick that got left in a hostel. And the third was a leather belt, which seemed like a good idea at the time, but it's a lot of work to take down when you need to use the bathroom outside in the fresh air. So the trip went kind of like this. I flew to France, took another flight to Orly, rented a car, which took me down the coast and dropped me off without a care in St. John, Pied-de-Port, which is where I was beginning my trek. He literally just drove away and left me there. And I was shell-shocked, and I was exhausted, and I'm going to use the word over and over again, I was terrified. The hotel room that I reserved was closed when I arrived. There was a note in French in the window, which I couldn't read, and I asked for help, and someone said, "Oh, they are on vacation." Are you kidding me? So I sat down on the side of the road, not on the side of the road, in this long cobblestone path leading up with houses on either side. Spain is very stunning. And I was 2 inches away from crying. I didn't know where I was going to stay. I didn't know how to talk to anyone. I was afraid to speak to people because I'd heard that the French didn't like Americans. And oh my God, what if somebody doesn't like me? That would be like the end of life. While I was sitting there, I was looking up and down this very steep cobblestone street, and I saw a woman sitting a few houses down. She looked at me and she tilted her head and she went like this. And that's a universal signal. I knew exactly what that meant, and I went and I followed her in her house. She spoke only Spanish. I spoke only English. She knew why I was there. I needed a place to sleep. So she brought me up to this little room with a twin bed and a shower and said a few things to me that were probably meant to be encouraging, and went away. And I spent the night, my first night in France, in a little dark albergue by myself, and I could not, I didn't know why I was there. I didn't understand why I was there, but I knew I had to be. When I woke up by my alarm, it was dark outside, and I packed up my bag and stepped out into the street, and I didn't even know which way to go. I didn't know where the path began. It was all so foreign to me. And there were a lot of people. People were walking around with, like they knew what they were doing. And so I just picked somebody and started following them, figuring they would either lead me back to their house or they would lead me to the beginning of the trail. And I'm trying to remember what I had seen in the movie The Way, so that I could, make sure I was not heading the wrong distance, the wrong way. And I started to walk. And I don't think I got a quarter of a mile out of town, and it started pouring. There are two schools of thought about rain gear on the Camino: jacket and pants, poncho. I went with jacket and pants. I regretted not having a poncho at the time, because then you can just throw it over the whole thing, but stopped on the side of the road, geared up, started walking again, and I still hadn't had anything to eat the night before or that morning, and I was empty. I had a pit in my stomach that was like a fist, and all of the people that were walking out of St. John, heading across the Pyrenees, they left me in the dust. They were so far ahead of me. I mean, dozens of people left town at the same time as me, and they were ant spots in the distance. I couldn't keep up. I was not prepared physically for this trip, but honestly, after speaking with people who really trained for the trip and they had their asses kicked, I don't know that you can prepare physically for the trip, but I don't recommend only walking 4 miles sometime, a couple of times a week, 4 miles. Yeah, I was completely unprepared for the trip, but I went anyways. I wasn't more than a mile out of St. John before I realized I was kind of in trouble. I was barely able to walk the increasingly steep, I don't know what the pitch was, but steeper than anything I've ever walked before. And I literally would walk a couple of steps, stop and take a breath, walk a couple more steps. I was so frightened. I didn't think I was going to be able to make it, and I had just gotten started. Somewhere between where I stood and the place I was scheduled, I had booked a place at a albergue called Yorisen. I don't know about my pronunciation, but anyways, I had booked a place to stay there. They recommended that you stay there and start from there in the morning so that you could get across the Pyrenees during the daylight, because the weather is fairly unpredictable, like it would be in any mountain, but there was no way I was going to make it that far. And about, I don't know, maybe a couple of miles away from St. John, there was a small albergue that I passed by, and it was, it was pouring outside, and sitting underneath this overhang were a bunch of drenched people, and I went under the overhang and sat there with them and just tried to recover and calm myself down. I must have looked exhausted and terrified, because there was a young man there. His name was Mats, and he was from, I want to say, it'll come to me, but I don't remember right now. Anyways, young man, about the same age as my son, who kept on asking me if I was okay. Could he give me something to eat? Could he give me something to drink? And I couldn't accept any of it, because I couldn't do it. So he was asking me if I was staying at Orison, and I said yes. And he said, would you like me to accompany you there? I'm going to make myself cry even remembering it, because it was like a it was like a port in a storm. I was so frightened. I was so frightened, and here's this beautiful young man offering to help me get there, and I was so grateful. And he walked with me. I don't even know how long it was. It wasn't even miles. It wasn't that far, but it was just straight up. And I'd take my few steps, and I'd stop, and he'd wait. And eventually we got to the place where I was finally going to be able to take my pack off and stop, and I don't know, just stop. So we both checked in, and I went to my room and took off my pack, and there were, quite a number of people that were there. There were, the room that I stayed in had 4 beds, and there was a large conglomeration of people standing around watching the washer and dryer. It was very important to them that they wash the clothes that they only wore for one afternoon. But I had plans to meet Mats at down in the dining room, and we had warm bread with butter and a thick bean soup that was, I realized I wasn't going to die once I got the soup inside of me. It was awesome. And he told me that he had to, eat and run, that he was scheduled to meet someone further down the trail, gave me a hug, wished me the best, and I watched him walk down the trail, and he was awesome. So glad I met him. After he left, I went back to my room and tried to sleep. What I was really doing was hiding. I was not tired. I was exhausted, but it was not tired, sleepy exhaustion. It was high alert exhaustion. So I hid out in my room until it was time to go down to dinner. And dinner was a wonderful experience. So this, I'll put a picture up. This was a large, long tables, big room, long tables. And, the food was very good. I was still really stressed out, and some people eat, stress eat. Yeah, I stress starve. So I wasn't able to get much in there. But one of the things that they did that was really fun was they asked everyone to stand up, say who they were, and why they had come to the Camino. Say where they were from and why they had come to the Camino. And people were from everywhere. They're from everywhere, guys. They're from every country you can think of, and some you've never heard of. They were from everywhere. And when it was my turn, I stood up. I said, I'm Cherie Burlington. I'm from New Hampshire. And I actually said Boston, because nobody knows where New Hampshire is. Cherie Burlington. I'm from Boston, and I have no idea why I'm here. And everybody started laughing, because that was fairly common. Some people wanted to lose weight. Some people wanted to have a religious experience, because originally it is a Christian pilgrimage trail. I'm not a Christian, and I guess I was on a pilgrimage, But yeah, it was quite extraordinary to be with all of those people and hear their stories and feel like I was part of something quite significant that I was getting ready to embark on. That was actually that was a high point for me. I enjoyed that. So I crossed the Pyrenees by myself. I don't know if I diverged from the main trail, but other than seeing periodic glimpses of the ponchos, the Toronto ponchos, I was alone. The area I was in was so isolated. I have a single photograph of a stand of trees, and when you look off the path to the left-hand side, it just went straight down. You'd never be found. Like, no one would ever know. Whatever became of Cherie? She went to Spain. We never heard from her again. That's because it's right there when you're walking. It was late in the day. It was starting to feel a little dusky by the time I arrived at the next albergue. That was a very grueling, very long day. I tried to eat the sandwich. I couldn't do it. I did manage to drink water. So the Roncesvalles is a very antique building. Looks like, I don't know, like an old church or something, but the main part of it, the oldest part of it, is just a giant storage room of people. Bunk bed, bunk bed, bunk bed. I was in these little cubicles with 4 beds. And I met a woman while I was probably at Orison, and we were trying to meet for dinner. I'm really struggling to put this all together. I need to tell this story. We were trying to meet for dinner, and there was a language barrier. There were many moving parts. So it never happened. We never met for dinner. And I ended up being sent to eat with 3 other people from different countries. I don't recall any longer. And I ordered fish, not realizing that at least at that place, when you order fish, you get all of the fish. Not the parts we're used to seeing in Applebee's. It was the fish with the eye and the head and the tail and all of the bones. And I was so hungry, and I had no idea what to do with this fish. And one of the guys sitting at the table was watching me, and he was like, no, no, please. I think he was from Germany. Please give me your fish. I will prepare it for you. Savages from New Hampshire. And he sat there and deboned my fish for me. So he said, you will ruin it. You will ruin it. So in the morning, on the 3rd day, I started walking like I would every morning for 42 days. And I was still in a state of bordering on trauma, physically in terrible pain, not used to that level of activity at all. So the next place is Pamplona. And this is where the official Camino begins. So I have a picture of myself standing in front of the sign, showing how far I have to go. That is kind of like the official Spanish beginning of the Camino. And I started walking. And the trail was absolutely lovely. It was lined with trees, and there was quite a bit of foot traffic. There were a lot of people. Everybody was passing me. That's the story of my Camino life. But they were, we would have these brief relationships with people that you'd have conversations with. The greeting was always Buen Camino. You know, you have a good Camino. Buen Camino. And, you know, what's your name? Where are you from? What brought you here? Those kinds of conversations played themselves out over and over again. And I heard a lot of fascinating short stories about the people that I met. A man from Ireland whose family members colluded and took his business away, and he was trying to heal from that experience and restore his faith in humanity. Those kinds of stories. As always, I always told everybody about my son. He was gone when I left. He had been gone for 3 years and 1 month. And I still need to talk about him. I talk about him a lot and often like he was here in the other room being a huge pain in the ass like he used to be. I still need to talk about him. So I told everybody about my son and that I had a little bit of him with me. Look what I have. I brought this. This is one of his pictures of his high school graduation, which he fought every step of the way. I actually had to graduate high school for him by doing his papers, whatever, anything to get the diploma. I brought this with me with the intent to toss it in the ocean like Martin's character did, and I couldn't make myself do it. But anyway, so I told everybody about Neil, because Neil was, I felt like he was with me. I always feel like he's with me, but I felt like he had a lot to do with my being there. So I cross over into Spain. It's raining. This is me. I've got a hat tucked up inside of my jacket. I'm soaked. And I am being photographed by these two women in front of me. On the left is Stephanie from Amsterdam. Now, I don't know it when I'm taking this picture, but Stephanie is going to become a very good friend of mine. She's going to be another person who saved me from myself, and I was very grateful to meet Stephanie. But I didn't meet her for a good while, so I was on my way to Pompeii. I was having a very difficult time physically. My hips were in very, very bad pain. I still had not been able to eat any food, not enough to sustain me. And I ended up meeting a man named Terry from Southern California, who might have been someone of some notoriety, because he was very private about who he was and where he was from. He was very private, but he was really curious about my son and really listened very compassionately and contently when I talked about him. And as we were walking together, we passed a place where someone had died on the Camino, and someone else had erected a memorial for them. And the poem that was attached to the memorial was the same that was read at Neil's burial. McGee, oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth, and something skies on colored. It was beautiful. It was the same thing, and I was telling Terry that. And he got very quiet and very serious, and he said, "Do you mind if I read it to you?" And I said, "Oh, please." And he did. He read it, and he read it with this earnesty and this deep compassion. It was very touching for both of us. I think he needed to do it. I needed to hear it. It was a very lovely moment. Not long later, we met a woman named Sue, and we were, the three of us were talking, and Terry was telling Sue that he was going to continue to walk with me to Pamplona because I was having a difficult time, and he was concerned about me, and he wanted to make sure that I arrived to the city safely. And Sue asked if we would mind if she joined us. Of course I didn't. And so I had this small band of travelers, the three of us. They walked at a shuffling old lady pace because I was really my hips were screaming. I was in a lot of pain. And they got me to Pamplona. And once I was checked into a place to stay, an albergue, Terry gave me a hug, Sue gave me a hug, and they left. And I ended up meeting with my Toronto Pancho mom and daughter. So that evening, Pamplona was preparing for a festival. Not the running of the not the running of the bulls, but like the preparation for the running of the bulls. And so the people at the albergue were basically saying, you're lucky that we even had a room for you because we've got this big thing going on. So Pamplona went from being cobbled streets lined with stone houses with a few people wandering around to an absolute ton of people, a ton of sound, music and bands and people running and children running and people pushing kind of like a wheelbarrow, but instead of a wheelbarrow, it had a bull with horns on the front of it, people pushing those through the streets. During the evening, I ran into Stephanie, the girl with the poncho, and we ended up having some drinks and watching the festivities together. And then it was another night and another day. This next day, was very, well, am I going to like keep saying the same thing? It was very difficult. It was the part in the movie The Way where they're at the very top of this mountain and there are all of these, they're windmills. That was my destination. Well, that's what I had to get across. Because there was that big party going on in Pamplona the night before. The amount of people leaving in the morning was streams of people walking down this rocky path, very deliberately laid out rocky path. And you could see off into the distance where you were headed. You could see to be the very top of the windmills up there. And once you get to the top, you now have to get to the bottom of that mountain. We were crossing this mountain. And this was not a trail. Like, there were people on bicycles and stuff. There were people with baby carriages. I don't know how they negotiated this unless there was a way around, but this was not a trail. This was a boulder-strewn drop-off that, like, if you lost your footing, you'd end up a couple of miles away rolling downhill. You really, I was using sticks. Don't go without sticks. Sticks are an absolute pot. You have to have them. If I didn't have my sticks to position myself and prop myself up, I don't think I could have made it down that. I was not in the level of fitness. I was in a great deal of pain, but I was not. There were young people that were like bounding like freaking goats from rock to rock. I'm like, yeah, no, I'll see you. I'll see you in Santiago in a couple of years. Anyways, you get to the bottom of this thing, and you know, one of the things about being on this trail is that there were vistas where you would be able to see, you know, I'd be standing here and I could see the trail winding off and disappearing into a mountain, you know, could have been 100 miles. I don't know how far it was. And I had this revelation over and over and over again. And this was the thing that was so empowering about the Camino, is that no one could do this for me. No one could do this journey for me, which is, you know, an analogy for life. It's some symbolic of life. No one can take the life journey for you. The only thing you can do is just put one foot in front of the other and go to sleep and wake up the next morning and put one foot in front of the other. It was, you know, it was pretty astounding. So periodically I kept running into the mother and the daughter. They were literally like beacons. I would see their ponchos. I'm like, oh yeah. And the day grew very long. And, you know, I spent a lot of time alone. And what happened was, I don't remember the name of the next town, but when I got to the next town, I was going to check into the same albergue as my Toronto mom and daughter, but they were full. And when I was getting ready to leave to go to a different albergue, the man said to me, you know, I'm sorry, we're having a festival this evening. There are no rooms. We are full. They are full. This, you know, and he was telling everyone is full. And I was pretty exhausted, and that was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, and I started to cry. He's like, no, please, please don't cry. And he pulls out a tourist map. And then he picks up a phone and makes a couple of phone calls. And he comes out with a tourist map, kind of like a cartoon drawing, and it shows that there's mountains here and this road goes that way. And you've seen them when you go into tourist areas. He lays it down in front of me. And he says, you are here. I have reserved a room for you here off the map in the middle of the table. He said, it's a little bit of a distance, but they will hold the room for you. Well, that's an adventure I'm not even going to get into. It took me forever to get there. And when I arrived at the foot of the hill that led to the albergue, I felt like I was crossing the Pyrenees again. So by the time I arrived at this albergue, it was probably another hour and a half or 2 hours of walking because of the sheer steepness of the roads. When I walked in the door, I had walked into the door of a barn. I'm standing there with my backpack and my sticks, and there is Stephanie and another woman sitting at the bar, and the other woman looks at me, and I am literally doing this. I am on my last leg. I don't have much left in me. And she goes, oh no. And she comes over, takes my stick, takes my pack, puts her arm through mine and leads me down a hallway and says, this is Stephanie's bed. This is my bed. This will be your bed. Down that hallway are the showers. We're meeting for dinner at whatever time. We will save you a seat. You know, it was awesome because I felt like I had arrived somewhere. Like I for some reason I had this feeling that where I was there, I was going to be okay. The fear kind of went away. I've run into this woman a couple of times, so now I feel like I know her. I just felt like I had finally arrived. I just checked the date. That was September 26th. I had been walking for 5 days. When it was dinner time, I went to the area, the restaurant area, and the tables, there were like 4 or 5 tables that were long. I'm talking about 15, 20 feet long, lined up like the Last Supper over and over and over again. So Stephanie saved a seat, and, you know, they were serving a fixed menu, which was called a pilgrim's menu, which I was always relieved about, because trying to decide what I wanted to eat when some of the food came with parts I wasn't accustomed to seeing, it was just easier for me if they just put something in front of me and I'd either eat it or not. And I I inhaled that food. I inhaled that food. It was absolute. It was salad. It was bread. It was this lovely, lovely bean soup, thick and delicious and creamy and buttery. And it was, I felt like I had come back to life, like to actually have some food in me just made this warmth come through me, because I was really about 5 days eating almost nothing, drinking water, but eating almost nothing. It was awesome. So this is where my Camino changed for me. That evening, I met Stephanie from Amsterdam. I ended up meeting Michelle from Corsica and Nick from Seattle. I don't run into them again for a few days, but this group of people ended up being my version of the way. So Martin's character ends up meeting 3 people, and 1 from Amsterdam, and so did I. So Stephanie and I became fast friends. She's a beautiful, blonde, curly woman, clear blue eyes, absolutely lovely, smart, funny, really easygoing. I so enjoyed meeting her. She was absolutely delightful. And we became fast friends. I think she was searching for someone to walk with. I didn't know I was, but I was so grateful for her. So Stephanie and I walked for, I think, 2 days together before we ran into Nick and Michelle again. And from pretty much that day forward, my Camino, I was not alone anymore. I was often alone in the sense that I've got a lot of pictures, like this one, of the 3 of them ahead of me. Once I started walking with Stephanie, Nick, and Michelle, things got easier. I was a few more days into my trek and was starting to feel very encouraged and strong in my body. My hips stopped hurting. I was thinking I was going to make it. I was actually starting to enjoy myself, and that fear of being alone and not having language. Nick had taken a lot of high school Spanish, so he was our interpreter. So that took a lot of the stress off my mind. So I'll tell you what I did, though. I gave up my autonomy to the group, which is a thing that I do. It's either in a relationship or wanting to defer to the group, not wanting to cause any upset, not liking confrontation. This I recognized as a recurring theme in my life, where I was willing to give up what I wanted because I was afraid, or because, yeah, it's fear. Isn't it always fear that keeps us from doing most things? It's now October 5th, so I've been walking for 10, 15 days. I'm feeling strong. I'm powering up hills. I've got a playlist on my iPhone that had some songs that if I thought I wasn't going to make it, I'd put it on and it would get me up the hill. I was finally at a place where every single day wasn't a struggle. My body didn't hurt any longer. I still couldn't keep up with any of my walking companions, but at least I wasn't in pain back there by myself. So we woke up one morning in, I think, Logroño, which is right outside of Pamplona. And it is buckets. It is coming down in buckets. And, you know, we're in New Hampshire in October, you can have some very hot summer days. It's the same longitude latitude. Spain is the same latitude as New Hampshire. So even though you go through a bunch of different weather type zones, and I was in, mountain at the time, it was very, very hot. So it came down in buckets, and we all looked at each other, and Nick said, "Would you like me to call a taxi?" And we were all scandalized by it, but we were like, yeah, because we've got to get over to, I think Burgos is next, and it is coming down in buckets, and none of us, we just didn't have it in us. And just so you know, when you stay at an albergue, they usually open it around noon, and they close at a certain time. I think the latest that you can stay there is like 10 or 11 in the morning. They don't let you stay. They don't get to languish. You're only paying, at the time, this was 10 years ago, I was only paying $10, $12, $13 a night in euro to sleep there. So they want you gone, because the next influx of people will be behind for them, probably forever, for the rest of their lives. And just as an aside, not all of the people that we met enjoyed, not just Americans, anybody that wasn't from Spain. Tourists, not everyone enjoyed the tourists. There were instances where you would deal with people and they could barely conceal their impatience. They were just tapped out, answering the same questions over and over again, dealing with people who don't get it. Probably, at the time I thought we were all ugly Americans, and every once in a while you'd meet someone who was so tender and so kind that you couldn't help but get choked up about it, because sometimes it wasn't awesome, but most of the time people treated us with regard. They seemed to recognize that we were doing something very difficult, and it was only periodically that you ended up having a difficult experience with someone. While we were in Logroño, we went into a giant cathedral, and I took a whole bunch of pictures of this cathedral. It was absolutely lovely. I hadn't personally seen anything like that before, and it was beautiful. But I wanted to be out of Logroño. Was a pretty good sized city. I don't know, not Boston, not New York, but compared to the solitude of the trails, I couldn't wait to get out of there. I wanted to be back on the road again, which I grew to love. There was a repetition and just a cadence to it, one foot in front of the other, knowing that I'll get over that mountain when I get over that mountain. I really had grown to enjoy the continuity of it. I enjoyed the companionship of my fellow travelers, but I also enjoyed when I couldn't keep up with them, and sometimes I didn't try because it was too much work. I also enjoyed my time alone. And when you're alone, like you are on the Camino, whether you came with people or not, it's a solo journey. There's a lot to think about. I mean, you're alone with yourself. Really, the only person that you have is, you have yourself. You can distract yourself with other people, but you are alone with yourself, with your strengths and your weaknesses, what you like and what you don't like about yourself. It's a very, very interesting learning experience to spend that much time away from television, technology, all of those things that are way more distracting now, but were definitely a big presence in my life at the time. Anyways, when we left Burgos, we were at the 1/3 mark of our trip. And when we left Burgos, our next destination was the part of the Camino that I had heard the most about. It was the part of the Camino that more people taxied through and tried to avoid experiencing. It was unlike anything I've ever experienced before, because it was so vast and so empty. When you see these pictures, you'll see it looks like, doesn't that look like the beach? Doesn't that look like a giant desert that I'm heading for? It was quite something. So one of the experience that I had on the Meseta was very emotional. I spent a lot of time crying, but really more primal screaming. So the next part of the journey was one of the most memorable parts. And it's also the part of the journey that when you read stories or hear stories about people who've taken this trek, it's the part that a lot of people bail on. A lot of people have talked about it's barren, it's featureless, it's, you know, I'm taking a taxi through it, which is fine. I don't judge people, the taxi thing. Sometimes you have to. But the Meseta is, this is what it looks like when you start. I am standing at the top of a very high mountain that I have just climbed up, and we are getting ready to cross that emptiness to get to whatever is on the other side of it. Look at those poor feet. That was part of my ritual when I left the house in the morning. When I left the albergue in the morning, we would Vaseline our feet. It was a major ritual, and you never didn't do it. You did everything exactly the same way every single time. I would coat my feet in Vaseline, which would keep my toes from rubbing together and getting blisters on them. And then I would wrap these things around my problem areas to keep my shoes from rubbing on them, from keeping one toe from getting caught under the other. It was a big project. By the time I took this picture, I had already been so far behind the three of them that I could not even tell where they were. They looked like ants ahead of me. There were flies crawling in my ears and up my nose. It was hot as a bastard. There was no shade. And okay, this may be too TMI, but if you are shy about peeing outside, you might not enjoy a lot of this trip. My entire Camino existence centered around where I was going to pee, followed by where I was going to pee next. Because one of the things that you have to do is stay hydrated. So I had a CamelBak in the back of my backpack, filled with however many liters of water. And, you know, I had a gadget so I could just drink it without pulling out a bottle and stuff like that. You hydrate and you pee a lot. Stephanie was like a freaking camel. This girl she wasn't peeing outside no matter what. So she always held it until we got to a place with a proper bathroom. I would not have, I would not have survived the trip. So the Meseta, if you look at these pictures, is a vast wasteland of emptiness without a tree. Jeez. Without a tree or a barrier or a fence or any obstacle to hide you from people on the trail. So I got very comfortable peeing outside and, you know, looking for my next place where I was going to go. And I even came to be comfortable peeing in public, because when I was in this part of Spain, there was no cover. You could decide if the front was going to face or the back was going to face, or they were going to see the side. There was no cover, you know. And so people were generally respectful. When they saw you squatting out in the middle of a dusty field, they could look the other way, and most of them did. It was a big part of my Camino, was peeing. Because I had fallen so far behind my friends, and I was having my struggle with flies and heat and inadequacy, and if they cared about me, they would wait for me, and people don't like me, and why am I even here, and what the fuck was I thinking by coming here, and how do I get out of this? I mean, I was a meltdown. I was ugly, screaming, primal, crying. It was it was very emotional, but I understand I wasn't alone. I think it's something that a lot of people go through, because it is so desolate and so hot and so endless. And every time you get to the top of a hill, which is not a hill, it's a freaking mountain, let's be honest. By the time you get to the top of the mountain, you think you've arrived somewhere, and you're not. No, you go down and you go across another giant expanse of nothingness. I'm not trying to talk you out of this. It was lovely in a very barren, desert-like way. This is the part of Spain where they grow their grains. So it is, don't feel like, because I'm making it sound like it was horrible, that you wouldn't want to go through this part. You do want to go through this part. But you might want to bring, I would, if I went back, I would bring a screen, bug, beehive. I don't know what you'd call it, but I would definitely be wearing one, because those flies were torture. So by the time I caught up with my friends, I was cooked. And when I saw them at a little picnic area, I just burst out sobbing. I was so relieved to finally be able to stop, because I couldn't stop, because then I would lose them, you know, and they'd be worried about me and wondering about me. So I had to keep going, even though I didn't have keep going in me. And when I caught up with them, I just broke down and just was convulsing in tears, and they all got a circle around me and all hugged me, and I, I recovered, and, it was, yeah, I didn't die. It doesn't kill you. It just makes you wish that something would. It's now October 12th. We are at the halfway point. It's pouring outside. And we sit inside this little cafe that only has 3 tables with 4 seats. Tiny little cafe. And it's coming down like a deluge outside. And I'm very self-conscious, because I'm aware of the fact that we are sitting in this little cafe. And I'm trying to spend as much money as I can while I'm there, because I want us to, I don't want us to leave and have to be out in the rain. But the woman who owned this cafe was so almost like honored to have us there. She spoke English, and she encouraged our trip. And when we would say, oh, we're sorry that we're, taking up so much of your space, she would say, stay all day if you like. Welcome to the Camino, Buen Camino, welcome. She was one of the people that I met that made up for any of the grumpy people. The next part of our trip took us through a lot of cities. We're in a much more inhabited part of Spain, and I was not a fan of the cities. I could not wait to get out of them. I wanted to get back on the trail. My group wanted to sightsee and go see churches and go to bars, and I was not interested in any of that stuff. I went along with it because, I was with them and I didn't want to lose them. But the city portion of it was not for me at all. I want to talk about this part of the Camino because it might have been my favorite part. It's now October 23rd, and we are going through an area. It has gone from being absolute desert to being lush and green, and we're walking through these paths that just seem ancient, and there's fern and trees and ancient trees bent over like old women, and really lovely. Everywhere we went, it almost felt like I was in like a fairyland or something. It was just filled with lush growing things. It was a completely different, almost like a different world from the Meseta, which was a big relief, but it was absolutely lovely, and I I can't wait to find out how it went for you when you get there, because I think you're going to go. The rest of the trip reminded me of being at home in New Hampshire. Not every step of it, but fields with stone walls and lush green trees and green grass and cow farms, and there was something very familiar about it. And I also, we were just days. We arrived in Santiago on October 28th, and I had vivid memories from the movie of what it was going to be like arriving specifically in Santiago. So let me just back up for a minute. Before, when we were on the outskirts of Santiago and we were starting to approach, we knew we were almost there. Our trip was almost complete. We stopped at a little, they called them bars, but they weren't bars. They were little cafes, and grabbed something to eat. And while we were there, we met a man named Edgar, who was from, I'm going to say Argentina, but I might have to correct that, later on. And he ended up walking into Santiago with us. And we sang. All of us were singing. I remember that was something that we were doing along the way, is everybody would, have a song on, and we would, sing while we were walking, because almost like the urgency to keep moving to get there was starting to lessen. We were almost there, and now there was for me at least, there was this, I wasn't in a rush. I was more just almost like strolling, like I said, the urgency had gone away. We were going to arrive within hours to the Camino, to Santiago, to our goal. Well, the way that they arrived to Santiago in the movie was not our experience at all. We end up going through probably the city of Santiago, and it was, one of the things that I've never even mentioned along the trip is that the reason you know which way to go is there are signs everywhere painted yellow with a seashell on it and an arrow pointing the way. So if you're paying attention, and if you're not, you end up backtracking because you realize there's no arrows anywhere. If you're paying attention, you follow the arrow, and it gets you 500 miles across an entire country. So we were trying to follow the arrows through this fairly busy city traffic, and having to really pay attention and watch for cars coming and such like that. So we arrived in the area of the Camino in kind of a back alley kind of way. So it was very anticlimactic. It was kind of a letdown. But once we arrived, we took this picture of the four of us standing in front of the Camino, and you can see the scaffolding. They were doing repairs, and they were also cleaning it. It had, thousands of years of, whatever accumulates on cathedrals. And so we took this is a very common picture that everyone takes. So it was the four of us taking our picture. And this picture includes Edgar. And the fun story about Edgar is that Stephanie has been with him for over 10 years. She met him on the Camino that day, and they've been together ever since. And that was kind of a fun ending to that story. So even though I wasn't in a big rush to get there, once I got there, I could not wait to get out of there. I wanted to be home. I was on fire to get out of there, to leave Spain and get back to New Hampshire. And I think I had scheduled, my flight was probably, 5 days in the future. There was no freaking way I was going to last there for 5 days. I wanted out. I wanted to be home. So I ended up, spending until I could reschedule my flight and get what did I take? I think I took a taxi to, it'll come to me and I'll have to put it in the whatever. Took a taxi to an airport and took a flight home, got a flight home. And I never saw Stephanie or Michelle or Nick again. I stay in touch with Steph through Facebook, although now that I've broken up with Facebook, I don't get to talk to her that much any longer. But Stephanie will always hold a very important piece of my life. And Nick was, you know, Nick was a former Marine. He dropped like 30 pounds while we were on the trek. He just, you know, he went from being a very fluffy man to a very trim man in a month and a half. It was pretty amazing. Michelle from Corsica, his reason for wanting to be on the Camino was to learn English. So his English was way better than my French and way better than my Spanish. So when we would be left alone together, we would be very uncomfortable trying to have a conversation. But I was telling him about the beginning of my Camino and how I was more frightened in France than anywhere else. And he said, why? And I said, because the French don't like Americans. And he said, oh, chérie, the French don't like the French. And I was like, oh, I wish I had known that. I wish I had known that a long time ago. So I've come to the end of the story that I want to remind myself and tell you. And I think what I'd like to tell you now is what I've come to understand about myself and about the world as a result of having taken this incredible journey. What I learned about Cherie Burlington is that I'm a trooper. All of my life I've been different than my family and friends. I see the world differently. I function in it differently. I'm incredibly sensitive to everything, so I feel things very, very deeply. I've always felt alone. I always felt like I was from not this planet. I don't know the name of the planet, but a different planet. For that matter, I have a little, you're not going to be able to see it, but it's a little alien face. That's me. The wing is Neil. I'm the alien. I did not feel like an alien when I finished the Camino. I felt like a citizen of the world. And even though I'm a conspiracy realist, not conspiracy theorist, I'm aware of the fact that there is a one world government in the making, and I want nothing to do with it. However, being a community, a part of a world community, I'm for that. I found out through meeting hundreds and hundreds of people and having these brief little experiences of them in their lives that we all want the same thing. We do. We all want the same thing. We may say it differently. We may dress differently while we're doing it, but we care about our children and our families, and we want to have a nice home, and we want to have meaningful work, and we want to have relationships with people that lift us up, and we want the world to be a kinder, gentler version of itself. We are the same. We are, humanity is awesome. I saw the most incredible compassion on the Camino, the most incredible forgiveness, fortitude. It was an awesome experience. And my experience of myself was of being finally, I felt like I was a part of, I belonged to something. I was a part of this world. I have since outgrown that feeling, but that was my experience of it. And my experience of humanity, I've said it in other videos, was one of absolute forgiveness. I could see the strength and the frailty in all of us. I love you. I love humanity. I think, oh man, such a crybaby. I think we're awesome. I think we're frightening. I think we are capable of enormous good and unspeakable evil. But when you drive down the street on your way to work or trip to the grocery store. Most people are staying in their lanes. Most people do the right things. Every once in a while you run into an idiot that just can't seem to get along. But I mean, for the most part, I think humanity is good. And if you get the opportunity to meet the humanity that I met in the 42 days it took me to cross Spain, I think you might come to the same conclusion. My name is Cherie Burlington. I'm an artist, an errant, an angel mom, and I walked 500 miles across the Camino de Santiago. And I encourage you to do the same thing. Buen camino.